Oh my gosh, it's so good to see everyone. We're so excited to be doing this. As Dr. Muck said, this was his brainchild 9 years ago, and we took a 3-year break with the pandemic, so we're so excited to be back and seeing all of you here. And while Dr. Muck just left us very hopeful, I fear that my talk is going to leave us not as hopeful. And if you've been taking classes with me this semester, nothing is going to be surprising to you about how not hopeful I feel about the state of the American political system and our elections. And what I want to talk about today is what matters anymore. So what even matters, right? The traditional indicators of what matters in US elections, what voters should be looking at, the way elections are run, these fundamental things that we know, I want us to question whether any of those things matter anymore. And in doing that, we're going to take a deep dive into the Georgia Senate race that's happening right now between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker for lots of reasons. So what do we know? There are things that we know that scholars have told us that structure the outcomes for US elections. This goes back to 2013, a book by John Sides and Lynn Vavreck, and they're writing about presidential elections. But what we're going to do is take some of the theories and apply it to elections more generally and some things specific to the midterms. So they argue that there's two things that structure a race. There's choice and chance. And specifically, what they talk about is choice is the decisions that are made by the media and by the candidates. How to run ads, where to run ads, who to cover, and how. And chance, which are the things that are completely out of control from the candidates. What is the state of the economy? How popular is the president? What are the issues happening at the time? And that's what I want to focus on today, is focusing on chance. The things that are outside the control of the candidates themselves. And then the way that we react to those things, those chance things that are surrounding us. So I want to focus on just a few. The first is the president's popularity affects how that president does if he's running for re-election, but also affects the fate of his co-partisans, or if it's another party member running for president, if that president's not running again. This is a traditional indicator, and we see these data all over the place, right? I always think about Dr. Muck with Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, like, yep, that looks about right, when the president's popularity goes up and down. And yes, the president's popularity matters. But I ask us to think about, and I say this to my students, do we really care about the president's overall popularity across the population anymore? That's not what we care about anymore. What we care about is, what do the parties think of their own president and of the opposing president? And over time, and we live in this moment, so this is not surprising, over time we see this polarization of the way that we see presidents. Democrats like Democratic presidents, Republicans like Republican presidents. It doesn't matter what they do, what they stand for, what policies that they advocate for, even if those policies are popular with the public, if the letter next to your name and the letter next to their name is different, you have no time for them. The argument is that the issues matter, right? Is that whatever issues are the most prevailing and pervasive issues for the voters dictates which candidate or which party they support, right? It used to be that we as a public didn't always see a lot of difference between the way the parties handled issues. So previously, it was, well, it's been a little different recently. We'll talk about this in just a second, but there are certain issues the parties own. It used to be that the Republican Party owned the economy and owned the issues of national security. And the Democratic Party owned softer issues, like the things that actually matter to us, like healthcare, childcare, and education, and the climate change, and climate, right? Which, if you're watching ads right now, the issues don't seem irrelevant because of what we're seeing, which is that's another conversation for another day. The last thing I want to talk about is the opponent. One thing a candidate cannot control is who they run against. No say whatsoever. Now, there are traditional indicators of what makes a quality candidate, right? The thing we use in political science is whether or not the candidate has held elected office before. That is what we say. That person is a quality candidate, a quality challenger when they're opposing an incumbent. But there are other factors that we look at that are not political science based. We look at education, work experience, if they live or lived in the community where they're running. And you might be thinking about some certain races that are happening now where you're like, oh, that does not define the person I'm thinking of, because that person does not seem like a quality challenger. And you would be right. Because over time, what we've seen is that these indicators, this one is specifically about whether the person, the challenger to the incumbent held elective office before, we see a pretty dramatic decline with House and Senate candidates. You note here with the Senate is that typically the candidates are more qualified because they've held elected office or they've served somewhere else before they run. But even still, over time, and this does not include the 2022 candidates, this just goes through 2020, we've seen a dramatic decline in the quality of the challengers for House and Senate races. Again, might seem familiar based on some of the ads you're seeing and the candidates that are running in races right now. So what even matters? If the issues don't matter, if candidate quality doesn't matter, if overall the president's popularity doesn't really matter, then what helps us understand the outcomes of elections in the United States? And the argument from the same authors who talked to us about choice and chance is that there's two things that matter. The first is that we are a calcified public, right? We are wedded deeply and sticky into our party, and we cannot find our way out of it. And it dictates every decision we make. It's the lens we use to evaluate everything. We can't be objective anymore. And because elections are so close, they're so close, the volatility of outcomes since 2006, we could not have seen this coming previously. But now every election we know, when you hear it's a battle of turnout, it is quite literally a battle of turnout. Which party's going to turn out more? And the elections are so close. So parties are strategic in, there's not a lot of persuadable voters anymore. We got to mobilize the ones that, that they like us already. And for the couple that are sort of in between, let's see what we can do to try to get them out, because it is all about turnout. These are the two things that help us understand the outcome. So does anything in between even matter, right? Do the issues, do the campaigns, does the money spent, does any of it even matter? Well, I think we need to talk about the Georgia Senate race to get a sense of whether this matters. But before we do that, we got to take a couple of steps back. So in 2018, Stacey Abrams is running against Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State at the time in Georgia. Okay, so Stacey Abrams was a state legislator, and she's running against Brian Kemp for this open seat for the governor. And there's this weird rule in the Senate that in Georgia, I'll talk more about in a second, that you have to get a majority of the vote to avoid a runoff. Well, Brian Kemp, this is exactly how he feels about Stacey Abrams and probably still does. He wins 50.2% of the vote. I will note here, and it is important to note, that as the Secretary of State in the state of Georgia, one of Brian Kemp's initiatives was to purge the voter roll of eligible voters. And you guessed it, most of those voters were black. So what Stacey Abrams does after she loses this race is she creates an organization that the goal of this organization is not just in Georgia but around the country, to make sure that black voters have equal rights and access to the ballot. You may also recognize that they're running against each other again right now. For the sitting governor, and then Stacey Abrams is running again. But we also have to talk about the 2020 Senate elections. If we can go back in our memory banks to the trauma that was 2020 as just a whole, but especially the elections in 2020. We had two Senate seats open in Georgia. We see David Perdue, who is running, and this would be for a full term, is running. Jon Ossoff challenges him. And then we have Raphael Warnock running against Kelly Loeffler, and theirs was a little bit different because of the type of race, and so I'll talk about that in just a minute. It was a special election. So Ossoff runs against Perdue, and we see that Perdue actually wins, but doesn't win 50%. So in Georgia, you have to win 50% of the vote in order to win on the first try, and if you don't, the top two vote getters run again in a runoff a month or two later, okay? So there's a very specific reason that this policy exists in Georgia, and it is to exclude or make it more difficult for black candidates to win. The fear of black political power in the state of Georgia was so large that they said, well, it's going to be impossible, or we're going to try to make it impossible, for a black candidate to get 50% of the vote, and so we'll say that they have to. And then when they don't, we'll make sure that they can't get it the next round, because we will either get more people to turn out, we'll try to get them to drop out. So the fact right now that we have Raphael Warnock as senator from Georgia is like a huge deal. But with Perdue and Ossoff, it goes to a runoff, and then we see that Jon Ossoff wins in the runoff, and he becomes senator from Georgia. Part of the reason it turns out this way, and for Warnock and Loeffler as well, is if you recall, and Dr. Mark brought this up as well, the 2020 election was rigged, right? And so President Trump and a lot of Republicans were saying, y'all should not go out and vote in the runoff in Georgia. Don't go out and vote, because every election is rigged. And so they listened, right? And the Republicans didn't vote in Georgia at the rate that they could have. And so this is part of why this happens. Raphael Warnock runs against Kelly Loeffler. they run twice as well. So the way that they do this for a special election, which is to serve out someone's term, is they run in what's called a jungle primary, which is that on election day, anyone who wants to run gets to just run, right? So they had a ton of candidates running on election day for this jungle primary. And Raphael Warnock actually wins by getting the most, but it's not 50%. So they run again, and then Raphael Warnock wins by 2 points. And so we end up with 2 senators, 2 Democratic senators, a black man and a Jewish man from Georgia, okay? All of this sets the stage for what's going on now. We can see how close Georgia was and went to President Biden in 2020. So you might be asking yourself, okay, this is a competitive state. This Senate seat is a competitive seat. Why would the Republicans run Herschel Walker? Herschel Walker with no elected office experience. Herschel Walker who has had scandal after scandal after scandal. Why would the Republican Party prop him up? Is he the best hope to take back control of the Senate? And I wouldn't have asked this question if we weren't in 2022. If this was in, 20 years ago, I'd be like, oh yeah, this makes total sense because issues matter and candidates matter. And why is it that Herschel Walker, who is repeatedly lied, misrepresented his business interests, said that he went to Quantico and was basically an FBI agent, right? Who has had significant issues with domestic violence and assault and with firearms. And this was all in the primary season. Why is this the candidate that Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party throws all their weight behind? And the candidate that wins 68% of the primary vote. The next closest person won 13%. And that was someone who had actually won elected office before in Georgia, right? So why? Why is it Herschel Walker? I'll give you 2 words. That's why. Donald Trump is why. In 2016, Herschel Walker, he endorses Donald Trump, and in 2020, he does it again. He speaks at the Republican National Convention in 2020. In the interim period, Donald Trump encourages him to move back to Georgia to establish residency and appoints him to the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition, which Dr. Oz is also on. Yes, so we're seeing a pattern a little bit, right? This is how this all rolls out. Donald Trump has super high favorability with the Republican Party, and while his favorability with Georgia Republicans is a little less than the average, we know that his words carry a lot of weight. Now, it's important to note here that Raphael Warnock had never held elected office either, right? So he doesn't have sort of that category there, that traditional characteristic that we would say makes someone a quality challenger. But before he served, he has multiple degrees. He'd worked in civil rights. He was the preacher at Martin Luther King's church. He had been rooted in the community in Georgia. And so some of the things, those other indicators kind of make up for that. We also know that candidates for Congress, we talk about if you don't have elected office experience, if you're an athlete, an astronaut, or an actor, the AAAs, you have a better chance because of your name recognition. So it does kind of fit. He's an athlete, right? Kind of fits. But is he the best chance to take back the Senate? This is the question I keep asking myself. I think it's important to talk about the fact that it's 2 black men running against one another. And yes, it's historic because this is happening in Georgia, but not for the reasons that you might think. Thinking about the Republican Party's strategy, right? What we know is that black eligible voters counted for half of all of the increase in registered voters in Georgia since 2000. Okay, so over this period. We also, of all the racial ethnic minorities in Georgia, the largest percent jump is with black voters. So the Republican Party is seeing the writing on the wall and thinking, oh, well, black voters vote for black people, just like women vote for women, right? Because every group is monolithic and doesn't actually have their own policy preferences or party preferences. And so we'll run a black man, right? Because then it'll chip away from the vote from Raphael Warnock. The other thing is that the party has a reputation and has had a reputation of moving towards openly embracing white nationalism. So if you run a black candidate, you can say, we're not a white nationalist party, we're a conservative party. And if you're a Republican voter, you can say, I voted for a black man. This is why some Republicans voted for Obama, right? We're post-racial, I voted for a black man. It's strategic. And the last thing that I would note here is this idea of the Republican Party propping up Walker as a black man in this race It doesn't represent a shift of a party that's being progressive or has decided to be less white nationalist. It shows who they really are. And I think about Dr. Butoric's talk about maintaining the racial hierarchies, about obedience and productivity, right? They pick this man, they prop him up, they run him with a party label that advocates for policies that hurts him and his community, and expect him to go into Congress and be obedient and vote with them, right? This idea that it is a black man being a puppet of a white man again. It is not accidental, and it shouldn't make us feel comfortable. Should not make us feel comfortable. So what do we know? What do we know? Well, we know that Herschel Walker is the perfect candidate in the perfect state at the perfect time. And we should not feel good about this. It's not a good thing that he's the perfect candidate in the perfect state at the perfect time. Because what this tells us is that candidates don't matter. Issues don't matter. None of it matters. All that matters right now is our negative partisanship and our antipathy, our hatred for the other party. That's what matters now. The question I asked is, are we so blinded by this that this is what matters, that we will vote for whomever that has the letter next to their name, and we will erase or explain away anything else? And the answer to this question is yes. And this is where we should all feel very discouraged and not so hopeful like we feel for Chile. Thank you so much.